everybody. My name is Anjali Shenoy Dahiya. I am not the General Counsel. I'm a Senior Associate General Counsel here at AppNexus, and I work on our commercial and our privacy teams. And I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about GDPR. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of what it is, and then I'm going to try and talk about the challenges it raises in the advertising industry. For us, and also how that relates to blockchain. All right, so what is the GDPR? It is this pesky four-letter acronym that strikes fear into the heart of pretty much everybody in the industry. But really what it is it's a law that is intended to bring transparency and control for users, for individuals at the end of that advertising transaction who are actually seeing the ad, to give them transparency and control over their data. And I just want to actually take a step back. It's not just for the online advertising industry. It's obviously across all industries, and it's affecting all industries in similar ways. The GDPR is going into effect on May 25th, but it's not brand new to Europe or to the industry. It's actually replacing what's called the Data Protection Directive, which is currently in force. The directive is basically a law, or not a law, but a direction to member states to implement laws in Europe. So basically what you have are a bunch of countries with all different laws trying to do the same thing, and there's no consistency. So the GDPR is one law across all of Europe that provides some consistency. Unfortunately, it's so vague that that consistency is really hard to understand. We're not going to talk about it too much, but there's also another directive called the ePrivacy Directive, and that is basically requiring consent in order to set or read a cookie on a user's browser. Okay, so I said it's applicable May 25th, 2018. It is actually adopted in May of 2016, and so we've had about 2 years to kind of bring ourselves into compliance, for all industries to bring themselves into compliance. It's about 70 days away, I think, and I know that because I live and breathe this every single day. All right, so I'm just going to go through some key terms very quickly. Just some things that we're going to talk about. So GDPR, it's about transparency for users with respect to their personal data. So personal data means data that's related to an identified or identifiable individual. And we're talking here about processing of that data. So when we say processing, we mean everything. We mean the collection of the data, the use of the data, the storage of the data, the transfer of the data. It's everything. All of that is the processing of the data. I'll talk a little bit about legal bases later. Some key ideas to understand: there are two kinds of ways you can be classified. You can either be a controller of the data. That means that you control and make decisions about how the data is processed. Or you can be a processor, which means that you just do whatever the controller tells you to do with the data, or in most cases, you can be both. Consumer rights we'll talk about a little bit later too. Security is just understanding what your obligations are with respect to keeping the data secure, so we don't have any like Equifax-like situations happening. Privacy by design is just thinking through how privacy plays into designing products and processes and features and functionality. And international transfers we won't talk about too much, but that's just the idea that when data transfers from Europe to a third country, there are certain things that have to be in place in order for that transfer to be legal under the law. Okay, so what does the GDPR cover? It covers, like I said, information related to an identified or identifiable natural person. Here in the US, we often call that PII. It's much broader than PII in Europe. It includes not just your name, your phone number, your email address. It also includes things like your mobile device ID, your cookie ID, your IP address, your lat long, anything that can identify a person, not necessarily all on its own, but if you connect it to some other kind of data, it can identify a person. Territorial scope. A lot of people are sitting here thinking, why does this apply to us? I'm in the US, I don't do any business in Europe really, I don't really talk to people in Europe, why does this apply to me? So yeah, it applies to companies in the EU and the EEA, but it also applies to companies if you offer goods or services in the EU, Or, and this is important for online advertising, if you monitor the behavior of natural persons. So what does that mean? That means that you are putting those people in segments. You are serving them ads based on their interests. You're doing all the things that are necessary for online advertising to be useful for the advertisers and the publishers in the industry. And this means even if you don't realize you're doing it, if the person is sitting in the EU, or if they're located in the EU when you process their data or when you collect their data, you're being picked up under this law. Okay, GDPR. Does everyone need consent? That's the tricky word. Nobody wants to think about it. Like I said, there are legal bases for using the data. So if you want to go ahead and use data, personal data of a user, you need to have a reason for why you think you should have the right to use it. Consent and legitimate interest are the two legal bases that we think about the most in the online advertising industry. Consent means that it's informed, that it's specific, and that it's clear and affirmative, right? So I knew what I was doing when I gave this consent, and I gave it to you knowingly and affirmatively. I clicked on the page, I said, yeah, I agree to this, I'm gonna keep scrolling, whatever. Legitimate interest is a balancing test. It's saying, do the reasons that I want to use this data, do they override the fundamental rights of the user? Because if they do, or if the individual, because if they do, I can't use the data under a legitimate interest balancing test. And you have to really think about what's reasonable for that user. What would they expect you to be using their data for? There are a few others. We won't get into them because I don't have that much time. Okay, so challenges. What are the challenges we're facing? So before I get into that, I just want to just show you these two slides. I'm not going to run through them, but these are basically just showing you the data flows in AdTech. This is on the sell side. You can see there's like a lot of arrows. They're going in different directions. All of those arrows, that's data flowing. This is on the buy side. And when I say data, Mike talked about the bid request, all of this data, all that personal data, IP addresses and cookie IDs and everything, it's on this data that's flowing. So you can kind of see there's all this data. It's very complex. It's moving back and forth. So what are the challenges we're facing? I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I'm just going to hit on a few of the big ones. So one of the things I just want to talk about, we talked about privacy in the context of business-to-business privacy, but GDPR is getting at users' privacies, individuals' privacy. And that's a really different topic. A lot of us don't think about that because we don't have the direct contact with that end individual. So we're not always thinking about what it means to be transparent with them. Transparency under the GDPR, it means that that user knows everyone in the chain who has access to their data and what purposes they want to use that data for. So when you think about that in the context of blockchain, right, you're thinking, how do you tell them, everybody, if you don't even necessarily know everybody in the chain that's going to get access to the data? How do you give the processes if you don't know how do you give the purposes if you don't know all the purposes that everybody in the data wants to everybody in the chain wants to use that data for? So these are things that we need to be thinking about. There might be a solution here, but we need to be very careful that we're not forgetting the individual's rights with respect to transparency. And then consent, right? We need to not just pass. So when we think about the transparency, we give the user transparency, and maybe the user has to consent or opt into you using their data. All of that data has to flow through the chain. We have to pass it along to every other company so that they know whether or not they can use the data for the reason that they want to use it. So how do you do that? How do you make sure that the data is flowing and that it's being kept secure while it goes through that flow? Those are things that we need to be thinking about. The other really big thing I want to talk about is data subject rights. So data subject rights are the rights that that individual user has with respect to their data once a company has it. So a company, they get this data in, they ingest it into their systems, they're using it, and then the data subject can come to them and say, I want to know what data you have. Tell me all the data that you have about me. Tell me every segment I'm in. Tell me my cookie ID that you have about me. I want to know what you know about me. So there's a couple problems here. One, how do you validate? How do you know that that user is who they are? I don't know your name. I don't know your email address. I can't connect it to anything necessarily. How do I know that you really are the person you say you are? We don't know. But when you also think about it from a blockchain perspective, every one of those companies has to be able to validate. They don't have any connection to that user, so they can't validate. The user also can say, okay, now we figured it out, got access to my data, I need to rectify it. You need to fix this line where you say that, this is my information, that's not right, you need to fix it. How do you make sure that it gets fixed all the way down the chain? That's very difficult. That's difficult even even outside of blockchain, that's a difficult thing to think about. So that's another challenge that we have just thinking about it now, but if you add blockchain into that, it becomes a little more complicated because the benefit of blockchain is that you don't that the ledger or the information you have stays the same for everybody throughout the chain, so it helps to alleviate things like fraud. But now you have to go in and delete it all down the chain, it causes another issue. They can also you can rectify it. They can also ask to delete it in certain circumstances, and they can ask you to stop using it. So all of these things have to flow. They can also withdraw consent. So now you have to tell everybody, no, we don't have consent anymore to use the data. If you were using it based on consent, you can't anymore. All of this has to flow through the chain, which is a very complicated problem, and I'm personally very excited to see what the solutions are. And one last thing that I really want to talk about is data minimization. So data minimization is the idea that you can only use data, the least amount of data that you need in order to do the processing that you want to do. So I get a certain amount of data in, I have to kind of cut out anything that I don't really need in order to do the work that I'm doing or the processing that I'm doing. So does the next company in the chain. So does the next company in the chain. But if I cut out some of the data, the next company in the chain doesn't get access to that data anymore. So it's just this idea of how do we think through these difficult topics when we're thinking about the idea of blockchain and the idea that data is supposed to be very secure and stay constant throughout the chain. So with that, I am going to hand it off to Aaron Brown. Oops, hold on, I have another slide that I just added. Aaron Brown, VP of Engineering at MadHive, who I think is going to address some of these concerns and has a lot of great ideas about it.